Picture this, an army that conquered everything in its path, from China to Eastern Europe, that left entire cities as nothing but ash and bones, that made the most powerful kingdoms tremble at the mere sound of their horses' hooves. The Mongols were unstoppable. They crushed the Rus princes. They annihilated the Polish and Hungarian armies in a single day. They made Europe believe the apocalypse had arrived. But then, 40 years later, they came back to Hungary, expecting another easy victory, another kingdom to add to their endless list of conquests. And you know what happened. Hungary absolutely demolished them. Not just defeated them, but crushed them so thoroughly that the Mongols never seriously threatened Europe again. This is the story of how one kingdom rose from the ashes of total destruction to become the shield that saved Europe, and nobody talks about it enough. So buckle up, because we're diving into one of history's most incredible comeback stories. Let's set the stage here. The year is 1241, and if you're living in Europe, you've been hearing terrifying rumors from the east. There's this new force, these warriors called the Mongols, and they're unlike anything the world has ever seen. They've conquered the largest land empire in human history. They've destroyed armies that outnumbered them 10-1. They've perfected warfare to such a degree that fighting them is basically a death sentence. And now, they're coming west. But here's the thing that most people don't understand about the Mongols. They weren't just good at fighting, they were revolutionary. While European knights were still thinking about warfare in terms of honor and individual combat, the Mongols had turned war into a science. They had intelligence networks that would make modern spy agencies jealous. They used psychological warfare, spreading terror ahead of their armies so that cities would surrender without a fight. They had a communication system using horse relay stations that could send messages across thousands of miles faster than anything Europe had. And their military tactics, absolutely genius. Feigned retreats, coordinated attacks across massive distances, integration of siege weapons with cavalry, the use of terror as a strategic tool. These guys were playing chess, while everyone else was playing checkers. So when the Mongols decided to invade Europe in 1241, it wasn't a raid, it wasn't a scouting mission. This was a full-scale invasion led by some of the most experienced generals in the Mongol Empire, commanded by Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan himself, and their first major target, Hungary. Now, you might be wondering, why Hungary? Why not just go straight for the richer kingdoms in Western Europe? Well, the Mongols were strategic thinkers. Hungary was the gateway to Europe. It had vast plains that were perfect for Mongol cavalry tactics. It was wealthy enough to be worth conquering, but the Mongols also had a specific grievance. The Cumans, a nomadic people who were fleeing from the Mongols, had been given refuge in Hungary by King Béla IV. To the Mongols, this was an insult. You don't harbor their enemies and expect to get away with it. So Hungary had to be made an example of. The Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1241 was, and I'm not exaggerating here, one of the most devastating military campaigns in medieval European history. The main Hungarian army, led by King Béla IV, met the Mongols at the Battle of Mohi on April 11, 1241, and what happened next was a masterclass in military annihilation. The Hungarians had around 40 to 50,000 men, a huge army by medieval standards. They were confident, they were well equipped, they had knights in full armor. The Mongols had maybe 20 to 30,000. By medieval logic, this should have been a tough fight for the Mongols. But logic didn't apply when you were fighting the Mongols. The Hungarian army set up a fortified camp on the plain of Mohi, protecting themselves with a circle of wagons. They felt secure. They had the Sajo River protecting one flank. This was defensive warfare 101, right? Except the Mongols didn't care about your defensive positions. During the night, they sent a force to secretly build a bridge downstream. At dawn, they launched a frontal assault across the main bridge, drawing the Hungarian attention. Then, their flanking force crossed on the secret bridge and attacked from the rear. Classic Mongol tactics. But here's where it gets really brutal. The Hungarians realized they were surrounded and tried to retreat. And this is where the Mongol psychological warfare came in. They deliberately left one side of the encirclement open, making it look like there was an escape route. The Hungarians took it, fleeing in panic, and that's exactly what the Mongols wanted, because once an army breaks formation and runs, it's not an army anymore, it's just individuals trying to save their own lives. And that's when the Mongols really went to work. Their horse archers pursued the fleeing Hungarians for miles, cutting them down systematically. It was slaughter. Estimates suggest that anywhere from 10 to 40,000 Hungarians died that day. The entire military elite of the kingdom was destroyed in a single afternoon. King Béla IV barely escaped with his life. He fled south, then west, desperately trying to stay ahead of the Mongol pursuit. And the Mongols, they didn't just defeat the Hungarian army and call it a day. No, they systematically devastated the entire kingdom. This is where it gets really dark. The Mongols split their forces and spread across Hungary like a plague. They burned cities, they destroyed villages, they killed everyone they could find. This wasn't just conquest, this was extermination. Contemporary sources, and yeah, they might be exaggerated, but even accounting for that, they talk about piles of bones, about rivers running red with blood, about the smell of death covering the land. Hungary's population, which might have been around 2 million people before the invasion, was cut in half. Half, gone, just like that. The Mongols spent the winter of 1242 in Hungary, and it must have been absolute hell for anyone who survived. They hunted down refugees, they plundered everything of value, they turned one of the most prosperous kingdoms in Central Europe into a wasteland. And then, in the spring of 1242, something unexpected happened. The Mongols left. They just withdrew back east. And the reason, Ugadai Khan, the great Khan in Mongolia, had died. Batu Khan needed to return for the succession politics, so the Mongols left, but the message was clear. They could come back whenever they wanted, and next time they might finish the job. So picture King Béla IV returning to his kingdom after the Mongols left. Everywhere he looked, there was destruction. Cities were burned, fields were abandoned, corpses were still lying unburied. His army was gone, his nobles were dead, his kingdom was in ruins. Most rulers would have. He just tried to rebuild what was lost and hoped the Mongols never came back. But Béla understood something crucial. The Mongols would come back. It might be in 5 years, it might be in 50 years, but they would come back. And when they did, Hungary needed to be ready. Not just ready, but so prepared that the Mongols would regret ever looking west again. What happened next is one of the most impressive state transformations in medieval history, and almost nobody knows about it. Béla IV spent the next 40 years turning Hungary from a victim into a fortress, and he did it systematically, methodically, learning from every mistake they made. In 1241, first, he addressed the most obvious problem: defense. During the Mongol invasion, Hungarian settlements had been easy targets. They were mostly unfortified villages and towns made of wood. The Mongols had burned them all, so Béla issued a decree that basically revolutionized Hungarian settlement patterns. He gave privileges to towns that would build stone fortifications. He encouraged the construction of castles, not just royal castles, but fortifications for nobles and even towns. And we're not talking about a few castles. Historians estimate that between the first and second Mongol invasions, Hungary went from having maybe a few dozen fortified places to having several hundred castles and fortified towns. The entire landscape of Hungary changed. But Béla didn't stop at just building walls. He understood that the problem in 1241 was also strategic. The Mongols had been able to move freely across Hungarian territory because there were no strong points to slow them down. No places where defenders could rally, no bases for counterattacks. So these new castles weren't just passive defenses. They were positioned strategically to create a network of mutually supporting fortifications. If the Mongols wanted to conquer Hungary now, they would have to take castle after castle after castle, bleeding their forces and giving the Hungarians time to respond. It was a defensive system that would make any invasion a grinding, costly affair instead of the lightning-fast conquest of 1241. And here's another brilliant move. Béla recognized that Hungary had lost in 1241, partly because they were isolated. When the Mongols attacked, nobody came to help. The Holy Roman Empire was too busy with its own internal conflicts. Poland had been invaded simultaneously, and everyone else was too far away or too scared. So Béla embarked on a diplomatic campaign. He married his children into powerful European families. He strengthened alliances with neighboring kingdoms. He made sure that if the Mongols came back, Hungary wouldn't be standing alone. He was building a coalition before the threat even materialized. But there was an even more fundamental change happening. Béla understood that Hungary had been defeated, partly because of its social structure. The old system had concentrated power in the hands of the king and a few great nobles, and when those nobles were killed at Mohi, the entire command structure collapsed. So Béla deliberately decentralized power. He gave more autonomy to medium and lesser nobles. He granted privileges to towns. He encouraged the development of a broader military class. This wasn't just about being nice to his subjects. This was strategic. By spreading military responsibility across more of the population, he ensured that Hungary would be more resilient. If the Mongols killed one set of commanders, there would be others to take their place. The kingdom wouldn't collapse with a single decisive battle. Béla also reformed the military itself. The Hungarian army of 1241 had been built around heavy cavalry, knights in armor, who were great for fighting other European armies but completely outmatched by Mongol tactics. So Béla diversified his forces. He encouraged the training of light cavalry who could match the Mongol mobility. He strengthened the infantry and crossbowmen who could defend fortifications. He brought in foreign military experts who had experience fighting nomadic armies. He basically studied what the Mongols did and figured out how to counter it. And there was one more element to this transformation that's often overlooked: intelligence. The Hungarians had been caught completely off guard in 1241. They didn't know how the Mongols fought, they didn't understand their tactics, they had no idea what they were facing. Béla made sure that would never happen again. He established networks to gather information about what was happening in the east. He debriefed refugees and travelers who had encountered the Mongols. He studied reports from other kingdoms that had faced them. By the time the Mongols came back, the Hungarians knew exactly what they were up against. Now, decades passed. Béla IV died in 1270, and his son, Ladislaus IV, became king. And life went on. Maybe people started to think the Mongol threat was over. Maybe they thought the Mongols had forgotten about Hungary. But they hadn't. In 1285, Talabuga and Nogai, two powerful Mongol commanders, led another massive invasion into Hungary. They came with a huge force, maybe 50 to 60,000 men. They were experienced, they were confident, and they probably expected this to be like 1241, all over again. Easy conquest, massive plunder, another devastated kingdom to add to their record. Except this time, everything was different. The Mongols crossed into Hungary and immediately found themselves facing a completely transformed enemy. Instead of finding easy targets, they found fortified towns. Instead of facing an army that fought in predictable ways, they faced defenders who understood their tactics. Instead of terrorizing a helpless population, they found a population that had been preparing for this moment for 40 years. The invasion of 1285 was a completely different story from 1241. The Mongols split their forces and tried to devastate the countryside like before, but they kept running into castles, and not just any castles, but well-designed, well-supplied fortifications, defended by garrisons who knew what they were doing. The Mongols were experts at siege warfare, sure, but sieges take time, and every day they spent besieging a castle was a day they weren't moving forward, a day they were using up supplies, a day the Hungarians could use to mobilize their forces. And the Hungarian field army? Completely different from 1241. Instead of one big force that could be destroyed in a single battle, the Hungarians used multiple mobile forces that could respond to Mongol movements. They avoided major set-piece battles where the Mongols excelled. Instead, they harassed the Mongol supply lines, they ambushed foraging parties, they used their fortifications as bases for counterattacks. They were fighting smart, using terrain and fortifications to negate the Mongol advantages in open battle. The Mongols tried to use their old psychological warfare tactics, but they didn't work anymore. The Hungarians had seen this before. They knew the Mongols would try to terrify them into submission. They knew about the feigned retreats, the false openings, all the tricks. And so they didn't panic. They held their ground, they defended their positions, and they made the Mongols pay for every mile of Hungarian territory. And here's the crucial part. The Mongols failed to take the major fortified cities. Pest, Buda, the important centers of Hungarian power, remained unconquered. Without taking these cities, the Mongols couldn't establish control over the far kingdom. They couldn't install puppet rulers. They couldn't secure their supply lines. They couldn't turn Hungary into a base for further western expansion. They were just raiders in a hostile land, bleeding men and horses and supplies. By late 1285, the Mongol invasion was clearly failing. They had failed to destroy the Hungarian army. They had failed to take the major cities, and winter was coming. Unlike in 1242, they couldn't just camp in Hungary for the winter. Every castle, every fortified town was a potential threat. Their supply situation was getting desperate, and so for the second time, the Mongols withdrew from Hungary. But this time, it wasn't because of politics back home. This time, they withdrew because they were beaten. Hungary had crushed them. The impact of this victory cannot be overstated. The Mongols had been the nightmare of Europe for decades. Their invasions of 1241, 1242 had traumatized an entire continent. People genuinely believed they were a scourge sent by God, an unstoppable force that would eventually destroy all of Christendom. And then Hungary proved they could be stopped. Not just stopped, but defeated so thoroughly that the Mongols never tried a major invasion of Central Europe again. Hungary had become the shield of Europe, and they did it through preparation, adaptation, and sheer determination. The success of 1285 sent shockwaves across Europe. Other kingdoms looked at Hungary's defensive system and started copying it. The idea of building extensive networks of fortifications, of preparing systematically for nomadic invasions, of developing diversified military forces. These concepts spread. Hungary's victory contributed to a broader European understanding of how to deal with steppe nomads. And as the Mongol Empire fragmented into different khanates in the late 13th century, and as internal conflicts weakened their ability to project power westward, the window for Mongol conquest of Europe closed forever. And Hungary's resistance was a major reason why. Think about the alternative history for a second. What if Béla IV had just rebuilt Hungary the way it was before and hoped for the best? What if Hungary had fallen again in 1285? The Mongols would have had a base in Central Europe. They could have launched campaigns against Austria, against the German kingdoms, against Italy. The entire history of Europe could have been different. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the development of European nation-states, all of it would have unfolded in a world where the Mongol Empire controlled or threatened Central Europe. But that didn't happen because Hungary stood firm. And yet this story is barely known. When people talk about the Mongol invasions of Europe, they talk about the devastating campaigns of 1241, 1242. They talk about the Battle of Mohi as this catastrophic defeat, and it was. But they rarely talk about 1285. They rarely talk about how Hungary rebuilt itself, how it transformed its entire society and military system, how it crushed a Mongol invasion that should have been just as devastating as the first one. This is one of history's great comeback stories, and it deserves way more recognition than it gets. The lessons from Hungary's experience are actually still relevant today. First, resilience matters. Hungary was devastated, its population halved, its army destroyed, its cities burned. Most kingdoms would have taken generations to recover, if they recovered at all. But Hungary came back stronger because its leadership understood that survival required fundamental change, not just rebuilding what was lost. Second, preparation wins wars. The 40 years between the invasions were spent methodically addressing every weakness that had been exposed in 1241. The fortifications, the military reforms, the diplomatic alliances, the intelligence gathering, all of it paid off in 1285. Third, adaptation is crucial. The Hungarians didn't just try to fight the Mongols the same way and hope for a different result. They studied their enemy, they learned from their mistakes, and they developed a completely new approach to warfare that negated Mongol advantages. And finally, sometimes the best defense is not trying to match your enemy's strengths, but making them fight on your terms. The Hungarians knew they probably couldn't beat the Mongols in open field battles with traditional tactics, so they didn't try. They built a defensive system that forced the Mongols to fight in ways that neutralized their advantages. They turned Hungary into a territory that was so difficult to conquer that the cost exceeded any potential benefit. The story of Hungary and the Mongols is also a reminder that history is more complex than simple narratives of conquest and defeat. The Mongol Empire is often presented as this unstoppable force that conquered everything until it eventually fragmented due to internal issues. And while there's truth to that, it ignores the fact that the Mongols did fail sometimes. They failed to conquer Japan, they failed to conquer Java, they struggled in Southeast Asia, and they were stopped in Europe largely by Hungary's resistance. These failures don't diminish the Mongol achievements, they make history more interesting. They show that even the most powerful empires face limits, and that determined resistance can work. King Béla IV deserves to be remembered as one of the great leaders of medieval Europe. He took a kingdom that had been destroyed and turned it into a military power that could stand against the greatest army of the age. He didn't just react to the Mongol threat, he transformed his entire kingdom to meet it. And his successors who renewed his policies and used the systems he built proved that his vision worked. They crushed the Mongol invasion of 1285 and secured Hungary's independence for centuries to come. The fortifications that Béla built, many of them still stand today. You can visit castles in Hungary that were built specifically to stop the Mongols. You can see the physical legacy of that desperate time when a kingdom had to transform itself or die. These castles aren't just tourist attractions, they're monuments to one of history's most impressive defensive efforts. Every stone in those walls represents a lesson learned in blood, a determination to never be caught unprepared again, and the broader impact on European development. It's hard to quantify, but it's definitely there. The Mongol invasions forced European kingdoms to think differently about defense and military organization. The systems that Hungary developed influenced military thinking across the continent. The idea that you could defeat a seemingly unstoppable nomadic army through systematic preparation and strategic fortification became part of European military doctrine. When later nomadic invasions threatened Europe, whether from the Timurids or the Ottoman Turks, European kingdoms had frameworks for response that had been partly developed during the Mongol Wars. There's also something inspiring about this story on a human level. It's easy to give up when faced with overwhelming odds. When the Mongols left in 1242, many Hungarians probably just wanted to survive, to rebuild their villages, to try to live whatever life they could in the ruins of their kingdom. But their leaders had a vision of something more, a determination to ensure that what happened in 1241 would never happen again. And through decades of hard work, through sacrifice and dedication, they achieved that vision. They turned defeat into victory, weakness into strength, disaster into triumph. So the next time someone tells you the Mongols were unstoppable, the next time you hear about how the Mongol Empire conquered everything in its path, remember Hungary. Remember that there was a kingdom that faced the full fury of the Mongol war machine twice, was devastated the first time, but came back and crushed them the second time. Remember that history isn't just about the conquerors, it's also about those who refuse to be conquered. Hungary's victory in 1285 wasn't just a military success, it was a testament to human resilience, strategic thinking, and the power of preparation. And maybe that's the real lesson here. The Mongols were incredible warriors, brilliant strategists, and they'd built the largest land empire in history. But they weren't invincible. No empire is. With the right preparation, with adaptation, with determination, even the greatest military threats can be met and overcome. Hungary proved that in 1285, and it's a lesson that echoes through history to this day. The shield that saved Europe wasn't forged in a day. It was built stone by stone, lesson by lesson, over 40 years of determined effort. And when the test came, it held. That's the story of how Hungary finally crushed the Mongols and shocked Europe. And it's a story that deserves to be told.